Hey everyone, welcome back to our Wednesday Bible study. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of heaven and how it's described in the Bible. Can we actually know what heaven looks like? The answer is yes. And so last week we talked about what heaven is and how we get there. If you missed that video, look down in the description below or look on your screen for a link to go back and view that video. As we begin talking about this stuff, we will be going to the book of Revelation. All right. And so the book of Revelation is going to give us kind of our description of what heaven is going to look like. And when we talk about this, what we really mean is the idea of what our eternity is going to look like, right? When we die and we go to heaven, when we live with God forever, what is that going to look like? And so some of this is going to be kind of how we get to that point, but also ultimately what the our eternal dwelling place will look like. So let's kind of jump in there. So Revelation chapter 3, verse 12 says, he who overcomes, this is Jesus speaking, says, he who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it anymore. And I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name. So what Jesus is saying here at the beginning of the book of Revelation is that heaven is, God's dwelling place, but heaven is a city, right? And it's also referred to as the New Jerusalem. And we're going to get into a little bit of that more here in a second. But it's described as a city with its name kind of being New Jerusalem. And it may not be the actual name. We may not refer to it as New Jerusalem as we're walking around in it, but here in this biblical context, it's being referred to like a New Jerusalem. Uh, and so later on in the book, near the end, when you get to Revelation 21, the city that he is referring to, this New Jerusalem, begins to be described. And so we'll jump over to Revelation 21, verses 1 through 3. He says, this is John now writing what he saw in this vision. That's basically the entire book of Revelation, is John recording this vision that was given to him. So he writes, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. That's Revelation 21, verses 1 through 3. And so at the end of all things, right, so in the terms of the last things kind of timeline, we believe Jesus comes to rule the earth for 1,000 years. At the end of that 1,000 years, there's a final rebellion. Jesus shuts down that rebellion, and then we go into the judgment, right? So where God judges the earth, and after that point, this new heaven and new earth are being created, and it's then that this city, this holy city, this New Jerusalem, kind of descends from heaven and rests on earth. And so remember kind of what I talked about before, is that there's this idea right now that our existence is comprised of two realities. There's this spiritual reality, and then there's a physical reality, right? And so these two things are kind of separate, right? In the Garden of Eden, there's this overlap, this idea that heaven and earth were joined together, right? And Adam and Eve experienced this kind of oneness, or this closeness with God, that was unhindered, right? But because of their rebellion, because they sinned against God, and God cannot reside um, uh, and tolerate sin, those two realms had to separate. And so now you have heaven, and now you have earth. And there are times where there's interaction and overlap between them, but they are not joined together. And so this idea is that we have these two realms that are separate, and God is going through the restorative process of bringing these two realms back together. And this is what we're talking about in this chapter. As you get through the chapter and you get to verse 15, he begins describing what this city looks like. And so he says, and the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies foursquare, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. All right, so you get that? Its length, its width, and its height are all the same. So it's and when it says the city lies foursquare, that means it's kind of in the shape of a square. So it's square, but then it's also just as tall. So that means that the city's dimensions are cubic, right? And so it's 12,000 stadia across, 12,000 stadia deep, 12,000 stadia high. Now I know what you're saying, Jesse. What on earth is a stadia? Well, instead of boring you with conversion charts and all of that and all of those things, I thought maybe we would call on the help of our good friend Google Maps. So Google Maps has a feature that allows you to measure distance from one point to another. And so I went ahead and I helped you. This next slide is going to show you what the dimensions of this holy city look like. All right, here it goes. There you go. So if you look at this map, if you can see my mouse cursor down here at the near the Arizona border. All right, if we start here and we go from Arizona all the way to nearly the eastern edge of Alabama, that is one side of this city, right? And then it would extend north through Alabama, up through, I guess part of Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Michigan, all the way into Ontario and Canada. Then it would shoot all the way over here, and then it would come back down through Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona. Now, that doesn't mean that this is where the city of God is going to be located. This is just a comparison to help you understand really the magnitude of the city of God. And so it's this massive place, right? It extends and covers most of the United States, and that's its square dimensions, but it's also as tall as one of these dimensions, right? And so it's 1,400 miles tall. So 1,400 miles on one, in every line. So 1,400 miles, but then also 1,400 miles high. How can we understand that? Well, let me help you out here. So this is the summit of Mount Everest, right? The highest point in Earth. All right, Mount Everest, the peak, the summit, sits at about 5.5 miles above sea level. All right, so if you were to take Mount Everest and put the city of God right next to each other, the city of God would stand about 250 times higher than Mount Everest. Now you say, that sounds impossible, right? If we did that, we'd be in outer space. Well, remember that there is a new heaven and a new earth being created. And so the new heaven and new earth that are being created are going to be created in such a manner that it's going to support the city that God is building, right? If God is the creator of the universe and God can create anything, then he can create an earth big enough for the city that he's envisioned. All right. So that is the height of this city. It's massive. It would make our skyscrapers look like ant mounds. It's just ridiculously high, and it's ridiculously wide, ridiculously deep. It's enormous. All right, it's hard for us to comprehend just how big this city is going to be. But if you look at that map, if you look and compare that to the summit of Mount Everest, we begin to get this concept of what heaven is going to look like, and just the magnitude of its size. So then he begins to describe the walls of the city. And so the wall of the city, he said he measured its wall for 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. So basically the idea that we're getting here is that this number is static, right? So there's not like the heavenly measurement of this and the human measurement of this, and there's a difference between the two. They're the same. So I guess angels are using the same rulers as we are. But 144 cubits, right? What in the world is that? To convert that into a distance that we understand, that essentially equates to 216 feet. 216 feet from bottom to top. That is the height of the wall of this city. So what does that look like? I went to England in 2008 on a mission trip, and in that during that mission trip, we went to the city of York. Okay, um, and in the city they have a an old cathedral. It's still in use, but there's this cathedral. It's called York Minster, and we went there, and we were able to climb to the top of the towers in here. So here's a shot of what this place looks like. And so I've been to this building, and so I've been inside, and I've climbed to the top of these towers that you see here. So those towers stand 236 feet tall. So the wall of this new city is only going to be 20 feet shorter than this building, which is pretty impressive. I mean, it's a massive building. It's a lot of stairs to get to the top. It was very, very tiring. But that is the basic structure of this city. And then it tells you kind of what the materials of this city are going to be made out of. Right, so we keep on reading in verse 18. It says, "The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold like clear glass. The foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst." And so hopefully I pronounced all of those right. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. So you have the walls that are made of jasper, but then you have stones within the walls of various kinds. And that if you do a Google image search for each of these, you're going to find these types of jewels. And so they're in order. If you start in column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, that's going to be kind of in order the names of these. But you can see, these jewels also come in various colors. So there's no guarantee that these are the colors of the jewels that will be there. Those things we just don't know. But at the foundation of these walls, these stones are going to be laid inside them. And so now we're going to take a time out for a second, and we're going to go back from verse 18 to verse 12, all right, because there's also more descriptions of the walls and gates of the city. So if you go back to verse 12, it says, "It had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and the gates 12 angels, and names were written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel." So on every gate, there's one of the 12 names of the tribes of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 gates on the north, 3 gates on the south, and 3 gates on the west. So you remember it's a square, right? And so on each line of the square, there are 3 gates. There's 3 access points. And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were written the 12 on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So the Lamb for referring to Jesus. So on the stones are written the names of the 12 apostles, and that's this description of this heavenly city. As we continue, it says, "I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb." And so if you remember, Old Jerusalem had a temple built in the middle of it, and in Jerusalem the temple was considered the earthly dwelling place of God. So in the center of the temple there was a room called the Holy of Holies, and the Ark of the Covenant was kept in that room, and it was believed that on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, that was the dwelling place of God, and only the high priest could enter there, and he could only do it once a year on the Day of Atonement. And so there was this idea that the temple was the house of God, right? So where the temple was, God lived there. Well, now God is going to live among his people. And so now there's no need for a temple, a structure where God lives and everybody goes to God. God is going to be among all of his people. And so just like God can exist anywhere at any time, and the Holy Spirit can reside in all believers, God is able to live among all of his people without having a singular place within this city where we would have to go to get access to him every time. Now there might be times where we enter the throne room of God and he is there and we are all worshiping with him. And so, we're not exactly sure how that is going to work. We just know that God can reside with all of his people, and there's no need for a physical structure to house God's presence. All right, that doesn't need to exist. And now here's the interesting thing. It says the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it, and its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. Interesting, right? So in heaven, there is no darkness, it would seem. The city is always lit. The city is always going to have daylight. There doesn't seem to be a sun or a moon to govern day and night, as we see in Genesis chapter 1. God, there's his glory is illuminating, right? And it's kind of hard to understand how that might work in a scientific manner, but if you can remember back in Exodus when Moses ascended to the mountain, and he asked God to show him his presence, right? He put him in a cleft of a rock, and God passed by him so that he would not see his face, but only kind of see his backside. When that happened, and he descended from the mountain, you can recall, if you go back and read that Moses came down the mountain and he was glowing, right? He had light radiating from him, it would seem. And so in the same way, it seems like God is going to be doing that for all eternity. There is a light that emits from him. He illuminates all of this creation that he is going to make, the new heaven and the new earth, and that he himself is going to be the light, and it will never go out. And so there is always going to be a daytime. And so I guess that means that we will never look at the night sky and see all the stars. I guess that's not going to happen. Instead, we get to be in the very presence of God all of the time, continually. There is no night there. But as we look through this, it says the nations, it's by this light the nations will walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. And so it seems like there are still going to be national identities to some extent, and there might be people who govern those national identities, but not in the same way that you and I think of things are going now, right? Like, we probably won't vote for kings. I think those kings will be established by God based on those people's obedience to God in that former life. So here on earth, as we are obedient to God, we will then have a judgment of our own, which won't be based on salvation. It'll be based on works. And so what we mean by that is that there is a rank and file in God's heavenly kingdom, right? And in that rank and file, you and I are going to fall somewhere in there. And it would seem to be that the more obedient we are in this life, the more responsibility we will be given in the next life. And so there will be more that we will be asked to oversee. And so that's what I think that's kind of referring to there. It says in verse 25, the gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. So if there's no night and there's always day, it leads me to believe that the gates will never close, which also leads me to believe that if the gates are never closed, then something exists beyond the gates, right? I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Pleasantville, but in the movie Pleasantville, to kind of give you a quick rundown, Pleasantville there was a TV show that these kids would watch, and this goofy guy comes and gives them like a magic remote control or something like that, and this brother and sister end up getting themselves transported into this TV show, and so they're kind of existing in this Pleasantville reality. But Pleasantville is the only thing that exists in that world, or in that fictitious world. And so in Pleasantville, it was just the town. There was nothing outside the town. And so there was a scene in which he asked, hey, I see that this road goes from here to here, right? But what happens when you get to the end of the road? And they're like, what do you mean? What do you get? And so I think he went out and tried it, and he went down the road and to the edge of the road, but he only ended up back on the opposite end. And so it's almost like, a tiny little world in and of itself. Once you get to the end of the road, you just show up on the other side. So this whole city, this whole town, or this whole city, or whatever, was kind of all inclusive. I don't think heaven is like that. It would seem to me that if the gates are open, then there's an ability to access something outside the gates. So then that leads to the question, well, what's outside the city of God, right? What's outside heaven? Well, I think when we talk about new heaven and new earth, there's a city, there's a structure where we live and dwell with God. But then there might be some nature type stuff outside the gates. I don't know. The Bible doesn't seem to really say. And so it could just be that what we see in nature when untouched, trees and rivers and things like that everywhere, that might just exist. So if you go and drive down a long country road where nothing is, you get to see all that beautiful countryside. Maybe that's kind of what exists outside of heaven, but we don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't seem to say. What we do know is that these gates will be open, and it seems like there's going to be a passing through of sorts. All right, so let's continue. Verse 26, it says, they will bring into the city, the glory and the honor of the nations. How that works, I gotta be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure. But nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. And so only those who are saved and have a right relationship with the Lord are going to be allowed to enter the city, right? But in the eternal state, in the time in which this exists and we live in there, only believers are going to be present anyway. And so what this reminds us is that we have no fear of corruption of any sort, because as we will have been perfected, we will not be unclean or detestable or false, right? That has been done away with through the judgment that God has passed previously in the book of Revelation. And so then in chapter 22, we get a little bit more descriptive, and it says, then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Now, it would seem that from the throne room of God, which I can only assume is in the center of this city, the throne room of God, there is a river flowing out of it, and along that river is the tree of life, and this tree of life bears 12 kinds of fruit once per month. And we don't know what these 12 fruits are. The Bible doesn't tell us. It just tells us that a different fruit grows on the tree each month. So the first month might be pears, the second might be oranges, the third month might be peaches, and so on and so on. We don't know, but it says that the leaves of the tree were there for the healing of the nations, and it'll be interesting to see how that works in reality, because it would seem that we are already healed and perfected, and so I don't know. What the purpose of the tree of life is still kind of a mystery of how that works in the eternal state. And so no longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. And so in this city, we have this massive, this massive city that's 1,400 miles square. Then we have a city that is 1,400 miles high, unbelievably tall. And then the walls are 216 feet high. And in those walls are these fine jewels. And with those fine jewels are the names of the apostles on the gates, the names of the tribes of Israel. So let's just kind of resume or recap all of this real quick. So the quick facts: the city will measure approximately 1,400 feet square. Its height will be the same. So it'll stand 250 times higher than Mount Everest will. Its walls will stand 216 feet. The walls will have 12 precious stones with the name of the 12 apostles written on them. And I can only imagine on a wall that extends 1,400 miles all the way around a city, there's going to be many, 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 many stones. And so the many, many stones and the many, many names of the apostles on those stones is going to be all along the foundation of this wall, the wall itself being made out of jasper. Now, in that wall, there will be 3 gates on either wall. So 3 on the north, 3 on the south, 3 on the east, 3 on the west. And all of that is going to, and will have the names of the 12 tribes of Israel written on them. And so then the gates will remain open at all times, which seems to allow a passing through of the gates, or from the city to whatever is outside the city. The question is, what is outside the city? We just don't know. It doesn't seem that the Bible gives us that information. But what we do know is that a river will flow from the throne of God, and along the banks of the river will be trees, or maybe a tree that bears 12 kinds of fruit. And so we don't know what kind of fruit that is. The fruit is unknown. We only know 12 kinds. And so, well, that's something we'll have to see when we get there. And so we do know that the heavenly city will be a beautiful city. The gold is described as transparent or very, very, very shiny. It's very difficult to understand what is actually meant by that, but it seems like the gold is going to be of the purest form. The entire city is going to be far beyond what we can ever hope or imagine. It'll be beautiful, extraordinarily beautiful. And what's better is that the presence of God will be in that city and will be among us forever and ever and ever and ever. You and I, having accepted Christ as Lord and Savior of our lives, accepted his offer of forgiveness, will spend eternity with God in heaven one day. And that heaven, that heavenly realm that we understand today and that earthly realm that we live in now will one day be joined, and that there will be no separation between God and man ever again. And that is our glorious hope. So next week we'll talk a little bit more about heaven, and probably the concept of angels a little bit. What are angels? And then we'll talk about some things that are considered a little bit like folklore, like Peter checking attendance at the pearly gates. And so all of that, some of that stuff. And so I hope you're looking forward to it. Remember that that our only entrance into heaven is through Christ. You know, Christ says that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the Father but through him. We are a sinful human being, and we have rebelled against God. And that rebellion requires judgment, and that judgment has been overcome by Christ, who has laid himself down as a sacrifice for you and I. And so if you don't know Jesus, if you don't know him as Lord and Savior of your life, then I encourage you, reach out to me. You can comment through YouTube. You can send me an email. Like a YouTube comment is probably the best. It'll come straight to my phone. And I'll be sure to get back to you. And we'll have a discussion. But if you don't know that you are saved, and you want to know that, then let me know. I'm happy to talk to you. Until then, I love you. God bless. Stay safe. And hopefully we will see you in person very, very soon. Love you. God bless.